in 1793, noted French scientist Joseph Dombey departed Le Havre, France, bound for Philadelphia. His mission was to meet with Thomas Jefferson and give him two of the rarest items on Earth. Unfortunately for Dombey, fate had other intentions, and storms pushed the ship he was aboard well off course. And so it was that around the time he was supposed to deliver his precious cargo to Jefferson, he found himself instead at the mercy of British pirates. Being French in this situation, not exactly ideal, so at first he attempted to pass himself off as Spanish, but his accent gave him away. Dombey was eventually taken to the small Caribbean island of Montserrat, where he ultimately died before he could be ransomed. So, what was the precious cargo that he had decided to deliver as a gift to the United States? Well, this was two small copper items, of which only 6 sets existed on Earth at the time. They were standards that represented a meter and a grave, the latter being better known today as a kilogram. At the time, the United States, having already become one of the first nations in the world to adopt a decimal base 10 system for currency, was strongly considering doing the same for their system of weights and measures. The idea was to get rid of the mix of British weights and measures that were mixed with other systems that were commonly used throughout the young nation. Thus, with the initial strong support of then Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, and thanks to a desire to continue to strengthen ties between France and the United States, adoption of the new French metric system seemed rather close at hand. Along with a trade agreement concerning grain export to France, Dombey was to deliver the meter and grave standards and attempt to argue the system's merits to Congress, who at the time were quite open to adopting these units of measure. Of course, we all know how this turned out. Dombey never got a chance to make his arguments, thanks to concerns about whether the metric system would stick around at all in France, combined with the fact that trade between Britain and the US would be hindered by such a change. The US eventually decided to abandon efforts to adopt the metric system, and mostly just stuck with the British system, though the US customary units and what would become the imperial system would soon diverge in the following decades. But as more and more nations came to adopt this new system of weights and measures, the US slowly began to follow suit. Fast forwarding to 1866, and with the Metric Act, the US officially sanctioned the use of the metric system in all contracts, dealings, or court proceedings, and provided each state with standard metric weights and measures. In 1876, the United States was one of just 17 nations to sign the Treaty of the Meter, establishing, among other things, the International Bureau of Weights and Measure to govern this system. Fast forward to a little under a century later, and the full switch seemed inevitable in the United States after the 1968 Metric Study Act. This ended up being a 3-year study looking at the feasibility of switching the United States to the metric system. The result? Well, that was a report titled A Metric America, a decision whose time has come. This recommended that the change should take place and said that it could be done in as little as 10 years. Unfortunately, the public was largely either apathetic or strongly opposed to making the switch. According to a Gallup poll at the time, 45% were against it. This was nothing new, however. A huge percentage of the time that a given people of a nation have been asked by their government to switch to the international system of units, the general public of those nations were largely against it, even France itself, who went back and forth for decades on the issue. Indeed, it was this going back and forth that contributed to the United States' hesitation to adopt the system in the early going. Brazil actually experienced a genuine uprising when the government forced the change in the late 19th century. Over half a century later, British citizens still stubbornly cling to many of the old measurements in their day-to-day lives, though they've otherwise adopted SI units. So why did all of these governments frequently go against the will of their people? Well, arguments for the economic benefit simply won out. As in so many matters of government, what businesses want, businesses often get. So the governments ignored the will of the general public, and they did it anyway. But in the US, the situation was different. Not having the pressure from being bordered and economically as bound to one's neighbors as in Europe, and being one of the world's foremost economic powerhouses itself, the immediate economic benefit, it didn't seem so clear. For example, California alone, one of 50 states, if it was its own nation, would have the 5th largest economy in the world. Texas and New York State aren't far behind when compared to nations of the world's economies at 10th and 13th place respectively, let alone the other 47 states. Seeing lesser readily apparent economic benefit and not having the same geographic pressures as in Europe, in the 1970s many big businesses and unions were in strong opposition to the change, citing the cost of making the switch, and on the latter side, unions worried that such a change would make it easier to move jobs that formerly used customary units overseas, given that now such product could be more easily purchased from abroad. Swayed when the 1975 Metric Conversion Act was signed by President Gerald Ford, it had largely lost its teeth. While it did establish a board whose job it was to facilitate the nation's conversion and put forth various recommendations, the act did not have an official timeline, and the switch was voluntary. Nevertheless, contrary to popular belief, in the decades since, the United States actually has largely switched to the metric system. Just the general public, both domestic and international, seem largely ignorant of this. The US military almost exclusively uses the metric system. Since the early 1990s, the federal government has largely been converted, and the majority of big businesses have made the switch in one form or another, wherever possible. In fact, with the passage of the Metric Conversion Act of 1988, the metric system became the preferred system of weights and measures for United States trade and commerce. In the medical field and pharmaceuticals, the metric system is also used almost exclusively. In fact, since the Mendenhall Order of 1893, even the units of measure used by the layperson in the US, the yard, foot, inch, and pound, have all been officially defined by the meter and the kilogram. Speaking of the general public side, nobody in the US blinks an eye about food labels containing both metric and customary units, required thanks to the Fair Packaging and Labeling Act, with the majority of states since also allowing metric only. The gram is commonly used to measure everything from the amount of flour to add into a recipe to how much marijuana one buys from a shop, or, where it's still illegal, their local dealer. And if you were to ask someone to pick you up a 2-liter of Dr. Pepper, or how a person did running a 10K, most everyone in the US would know exactly what you're talking about. Beyond this, you'd be hard-pressed to find a ruler in the United States that doesn't include both inches and centimeters and their common divisors. Further, in school, both customary units and the metric system are taught. Yes, while many Americans generally have little practical need to learn a second language, most are, at least for a time, reasonably fluent in two very different systems of measurement. As with languages unpracticed, however, once out of school, many lose their sense of the latter from lack of use and concrete perspective. It's one thing to know what 100 and 0 degrees Celsius refers to with respect to water, but it's a whole different thing to get what temperature you might want to put on a jacket for. However, students who go on to more advanced science classes quickly pick up this perspective as they become more familiar, and thus the scientists of America aren't at the slightest disadvantaged here. All students that go along that path become just as familiar as their European brethren, if just a little later in life. So this all brings us around to why the United States hasn't made the switch to the metric system more official than it already is. Well, primarily there are 3 reasons: cost, human psychology, and, at least on the general public side, little readily apparent practical reason to do so. As to cost, while there has never been a definitive study showing how much it would cost the United States to make the switch official and universal, general estimates range even upwards of $1 trillion, all things considered. Why so high? Well, to begin with, we'll discuss a relatively small example in road signs. Installing street signs is an incredibly expensive affair in many places for a variety of reasons. For instance, in 2011, the Washington State Department of Transportation claimed it costs anywhere from $30,000 to $75,000 per sign, though they later clarified that those were the worst case and most expensive scenarios, and sometimes the signs and installation can only ring in at around $10,000. Bronley Mishler of The Dot explains, installing a sign along a highway isn't quite as simple as pounding some posts into a ground and bolting a sign to it. That's why the costs are so variable. There are 2 ways to replace a sign. One way allows us to uninstall it under old rules. The second way requires us to follow new federal standards. The old rules apply if we are just fixing something, not building something new. Installing a new sign along the road counts as fixing something, basically just giving drivers more information. If we install a sign on the side of the road, it would cost $2,000 to make the sign, buy the beams and rivets, $8,000 for 2 steel poles and concrete, $5,000 to clear brush and other landscape work before and after installation, $15,000 for maintenance crews to set up traffic cones, work vehicles, program highway signs, and spend the evening doing the work. Total, $30,000. The new rules apply if we are doing a new construction project. Costs would be higher because we would have to bring everything up to the current highway code. These often involve putting up a sign bridge, a steel structure that spans the entire freeway to hold up multiple signs. Typical costs include $2,600 to make the sign, buy the beams and rivets because the sign must be bigger, $75,000 for the sign bridge, for a total of $77,600. WS. Deputy Regional Administrator Bill Vleck also stated, beyond many of these signs needing to be special ordered on a one-off variety, think a highway sign with a city name on it and a distance marker, and them often being much larger than most sign makers make, drastically increases the cost. Further, there are sometimes special features that increase the cost of the sign, and we don't really know about them. For instance, Flex states that if there's an auto accident, if a car hits that signpost and there's any kind of injury involved, the state is going to be liable, so we're looking potentially at a multi-million-dollar settlement in those kinds of situations. So it would have to be a breakaway type signpost, and it has to be specially fabricated so that if a car hits that sign, it reacts appropriately and doesn't come down and basically take out the occupants. For your reference here, in 1995 it was estimated that approximately 6 million signs would need to be changed on federal and state roads. On top of that, it was noted that approximately just shy of 3 million of the nation's about 4.2 million miles, that's 6.8 million kilometers of public roads, are actually local, with an uncertain number of signs in those regions that would need to be changed. That said, the rather obscene costs quoted by the aforementioned Washington State DOT would likely be grossly overestimated on a project such as this, with prices massively reduced if special laws were passed to remove much of the red tape, and given the extreme bulk orders that would be called for here, including for the signs themselves and contracts to dedicated crews to make this happen as fast as possible. For example, in 1995, Alabama estimated that they could swap out all of the signs on federal highways for a mere $70 per sign, which is $120 in today's money on average. Perhaps a better rubric would be looking at Canada's switch, swapping out around 250,000 signs on their 300,000 miles, that's 482,000 kilometers, of road. The total reported cost, only a little over $13 million, which is about $61 million today, or around $244 per sign in today's dollars. Extrapolating that out to the minimum 6 million signs, that would then cost approximately $1.5 billion, plus whatever additional signs needed to be swapped out on the 3/4 of all the rest of the roads that are not accounted for in that 6 million sign estimate. Not an insignificant sum, but also relatively trivial for the US taxpayer to cover at about $5 per person, plus some uncertain amounts for the local road signs that need to be changed. Moving on to far greater expenses, industry and wider infrastructure. While it's impossible to accurately estimate the cost of such a change to American businesses as a whole, we do get a small glimpse of the issue when looking at a NASA report studying the feasibility of swapping the shuttle program to full metric. They determined the price tag would be a whopping $370 million for that project alone at the time, so decided it wasn't worth the cost for little practical benefit. Now extrapolate that out to approximately 28 million businesses in the United States, their software, their records, their labels, their machinery, employee training, etc. Needing switching would be like some sort of Y2K event, but on steroids. Therefore, while it's not really possible to tell for sure, many estimate that it could swell into the region of hundreds of billions of dollars and maybe even into the trillion territory. At this point, even the most ardent supporter of the metric system in the United States may be rethinking whether it'd be worth it to make the switch more official than it already is. But do not fret, metric supporters the world over. To begin with, the raw cost of making the switch doesn't actually tell the whole story here. In fact, it tells a false story. While the gross total of making the change would be astronomical, it turns out the net cost likely wouldn't be much or anything at all. For example, average Australian businesses saw a 9 to 14% boost directly attributed to the switch when they made it. Back in the United States, when companies like IBM, GM, Ford, and others spent the money to make the change, they universally found that they made a profit doing this. This was largely from being able to reduce warehouse space, equipment needs, streamline production, lower necessary inventories, as well as taking the opportunity to, at the same time, remove inefficiencies that had crept into their respective businesses with regard to these systems. They were also able to more uniformly manage their businesses abroad and domestic to the same standards and systems. As a very small example, GM reported they were able to reduce its number of fan belts that they had to manufacture and stock from about 900 sizes to 100, thanks to everything that went with the switch. In some cases, the businesses also noted new international markets opening up, both in sales and ability to more easily and often more cheaply acquire product abroad. All of this resulted in a net profit extremely quickly from investing the money into making the switch. As you might expect from these types of benefits, an estimated 30% of businesses in the United States have largely already switched to metric. Granted, these are generally large companies, and various small businesses dealing locally might not see such a benefit. However, with the increasing globalization of supply chains, many small businesses would likely still see some benefit. Unfortunately, particularly when it comes to construction, that general industry has lagged well behind others in switching, and as you might imagine, the existing infrastructure of the nation, from roads to bridges to homes to drill bits to screws to the architectural plans for all of it being based on customary units would not be cheap to change, and it isn't clear what the cost would be. However, as in all of this, the cost could potentially be mitigated via a slow phase-out approach with grandfathering allowed, similar to what other nations did, though in most cases on a vastly smaller scale than would be seen in the United States. All this said, we here at Today Found Out would like to posit that what the international community actually finds irksome about the United States not using the metric system is not United States businesses who deal abroad, or United States scientists, or even the government, all of which largely use the metric system and all of which have little bearing on what Pierre, sitting in his mother's basement in France, is doing at a given moment. No, what upsets Pierre is that the US general populace does not use the metric system in their day-to-day lives. Why is this irksome? Well, beyond just the human drive for uniformity amongst one's community, in this case of the global variety, because English websites the world over, keen to get some of those sweet US advertising dollars, cater to the US audience and use the units that said audience is more familiar with. Those who are not familiar are often left to Google a conversion to the units that they are familiar with. The alternative is for said websites to include both, but that often makes for a break in the flow of the content, something we here at Today Found Out regularly wrestle with to find a proper balance. So this brings us around to the human side of the argument. To begin with, while the United States would unequivocally see many benefits to joining the rest of the world in some good old-fashioned metric lovin', as you might expect given the lack of immediately obvious benefits to the layperson, few among the American public see much point. After all, what does it really matter if a road sign is in kilometers or miles, or if one's house is measured in square feet or square meters? While some cite the benefits of ease of conversion to other units in a given system in day-to-day life, this is almost never a thing that's cumbersome in the slightest. If it was, Americans would be clamoring to make the change. The argument that ease of conversion between the units should be a primary driver for the public to want the change simply doesn't hold water in an era where, on the extremely rare occasion people actually need to make such a precise conversion in day-to-day life, they have little more than to say, "Hey Google." And in most cases, even that isn't necessary when you're reasonably familiar with a given system. Perhaps a poignant example of how, when you're familiar, a non-base 10 system of measure really isn't that complicated to deal with in day-to-day matters, consider that the world still uses 1,000 milliseconds in a second, 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, and 24 hours in a day. What few people realize about this is that the original metric system actually attempted to simplify this as well, dividing the day into 10 hours with 100 minutes in each hour. Unfortunately, most people didn't see the benefit in switching when also factoring in having to swap out their existing clocks. Nobody has much seen a need to fix the issue since, not even the most ardent champion of the metric system for its ease of conversions compared with imperial or customary units. And while you might still be lamenting the stubbornness of Americans for not seeing the genuine benefits to themselves that would likely be realized here, we should point out that virtually every nation in the world that uses the metric system has holdover units still relatively commonly used among laypeople that aren't metric, for simple reasons of not seeing a reason to stop, from calories to horsepower to knots to light years and many more. Or how about, have you ever flown in a plane almost anywhere in the world? Well, congratulations, you've in all likelihood unwittingly been supporting the use of something other than the metric system. You see, the pilots aboard, from French to American, use a feet-based flight level system for their altitude and knots to measure their speed. Just two standards that, much like the American public and their road signs, nobody has seen much practical reason to change. Now to more concrete human psychology for not making the switch, which has gradually been converting more and more Americans from general apathy to the anti-switch crowd as the decades pass, when one group of humans tells another what to do, occasionally using terms like idiot units and starting flame wars in comments of every website or video posted on the web that uses or discusses said units. You will universally get resistance, if not outright hostility in response. This is not an American thing, as so often purported. This is a human thing. Trying to force the French government to mandate by law that French is dead and English is now to be universally spoken for the sake of better international trade, economics, and relations is not going to go down well. You might argue that in a not insignificant percentage of the world, English is already the standard in such international business dealings, but that is really little different than the current situation in business in the US concerning the metric system. What we're talking about is how the general populace of France would react if the government mandated such a change, and even more so if outside nations were pressuring it. Again, it's not an American thing, it's a human thing. Beyond that, as everyone who's ever done anything online is well aware of, humans hate change. They loathe it, in fact. Make a change change to, say, the format or style of a video, no matter how small, and rest assured that no matter if the change is unequivocally vastly superior and the audience universally comes to agree with that, a not insignificant number of one's audience will complain, sometimes vehemently. More directly, we see this again and again throughout the history of various nations making the change to SI. Again, resistance to change is not an American thing, it's a human thing. But fret not, world. You see, slowly but surely the United States has been converting to metric, and for most practical purposes for those outside of the United States, other than having to see it on websites, which again we posit is the real driver of people's ire the world over, the switch has already been made. So much so that at this stage, while the cars made in America may say miles per hour on the speedometer, the makers of those cars are using metric to measure and build things. The very military that defends America's right to use freedom units has long since largely converted to the unfree variety. In the end, money talks, and for much the same reason other big holdouts like the UK ultimately gave in, as American businesses who have an interest in dealing internationally continue to make the switch, they are seeing to it that the metric system more and more creeps into the daily lives of Americans. This will only continue until the inevitable complete adoption. Slowly but surely, America is inching towards metric, largely without anyone domestic or abroad noticing. If you want to make the switch last longer, well, continue calling them idiot units. A mildly humorous statement from a certain point of view, given that it takes more brain power to use customary units than metric, making the latter far more tailored to idiots. Also, continue to start flame wars in comments comprising mostly of personal attacks rather than using the many and very legitimate and rational arguments that exist as to why it would be of benefit to the people of the United States to make the switch. In the end, we all know there is no better way to convince someone to do something than making the whole thing a religious war, with you on one side and them on the other. Few sounds cause humans to cringe more than nails across a chalkboard, a fork scraped on a plate, or a heavy metal chair dragged across a tiled floor. But what exactly is it about this sort of scraping noise that is so offensive to our brains that many even describe it as painful? Enter researchers D. Halpin, James Hillenbrand, and Randolph Blake. In 1986, the trio of scientists conducted a study trying to figure out what exactly in these sounds humans the world over hate so viscerally. In the study, published in the journal Perception and Psychophysics, the researchers were hypothesizing that it was the high-pitched sounds that were causing the issue and thus isolated the sounds between low, middle, and high frequencies. After playing these recordings to subjects, remarkably, they found they were wrong. As Dr. Blake noted, to our surprise, the removal of the high frequencies didn't reduce the aversive qualities of the sound, but removing the middle frequencies of the sound did. From there, when looking at these middle frequencies, they hypothesized that this must resemble either that of a sound produced by a predator or a warning cry of another primate. They ultimately found, indeed, as stated by Blake, it turns out the sound waves associated with primate warning cries, particularly chimpanzee warning cries, are remarkably similar in appearance to the aversive middle-frequency sound waves produced by fingernails on a chalkboard. Potentially worth noting is that a chimpanzee's human primate was the last common ancestor between humans and our hairier brethren, thought to have split around 13 million years ago, though hypothesized by some to still be interbreeding with us until around 4 million years ago. In any event, Blake then sums up, our speculation was that the reason the sound of fingernails on a chalkboard have an almost universal aversive quality is that it triggers in us an unconscious automatic reflex that we're hearing a warning cry. That said, it is widely reported that this hypothesis has been debunked by a study are consonant intervals music to their ears, spontaneous acoustic preferences in a non-human primate, looking at how tamarin monkeys responded to certain sounds, including nails on a chalkboard like screeching, as well as white noise. However, if you actually go and read the study, it didn't definitively debunk anything with regards to the former study, nor was that the point of the new study at all. Most pertinent to the topic at hand, all it showed was that tamarin monkeys didn't seem to show any more or any less aversion to the screeching noise than white noise, unlike humans who are adverse to the screeching sound. As to the debunking angle, this appears to be yet another case of something a lot of sources say because some source somewhere said it once, both clearly not bothering to read the study and acting like a single study was a lot more definitive than it actually was, a favorite practice of media outlets the world over pretty much as long as there have been scientific studies and media outlets reporting on their work. From there, nobody else seems to have been bothered to actually go read the study either, despite it kind of being their job when talking about this stuff. On this one, it turns out humans and monkeys are not exactly the same. It's a shocker, we know, and have slightly different evolutionary paths and, in some cases, range of vocals. As an example of how this can come into effect with sounds and tamarin monkeys, we have a 2010 study by Professor Charles Snowden of the University of Wisconsin-Madison looking at frequencies of sounds that tamarin monkeys do respond to. Important to note here is that tamarin monkeys' resting heart rate is about twice that of humans, and their typical vocalizations are about 3 octaves higher. In the study, they found these monkeys responded most strongly to music centered around their vocal frequencies and tempo of their heart rate, both in the sound's ability to agitate the monkeys and to calm them down. Further, the tamarin monkeys had no such responses to human music played for them. This is a common theme several studies show is true across various animals with different resting heart rates and vocal ranges than humans. For more on this, you can see our video, Do Dogs and Cats Like It, if you leave the radio or TV on when you leave the house. In any event, unsatisfied with this incomplete and fairly speculative answer of the 1986 study, researchers Michael Oler and Christoph Reuter decided to conduct a study ultimately titled Psychoacoustics of Chalkboard Squeaking, published in the Journal of the Acoustical Society of America in 2011. This more or less repeated the previous 1986 experiment, but using modern technologies and collecting a lot more data, particularly looking at heart rate, blood pressure, and skin electrical resistance of the subjects as they listened to the sounds of nails on a chalkboard, squeaky styrofoam, forks scraping on a dinner plate, and chalk making a high-pitched squeaking sound against slate. What they found is that if they filtered out the sounds from 2000 to 4000 Hz, subjects actually sometimes even described the sounds as pleasant. In contrast, when the offending isolated range of sound was played for people, they hated it, confirming it is somewhere in the ballpark of these frequencies that are the offending bits. Noteworthy here, for reasons we'll get into shortly, typical human speech tends to average about 300 to 3000 Hz, though for reference humans can only hear somewhere in the vicinity of 16 to 20,000 Hz. Going back to the study, while the researchers further found if they, for example, told the participants the sounds they were hearing were from a musical arrangement, people found them much less offensive than if they were told what they actually were. Regardless, though, there was an observed change in heart rate, blood pressure, and most noticeably skin conductivity when the unpleasant range of frequencies was being played. While fundamentally this research didn't really add too much new to the original study, the researchers here hypothesized that the reason we react so viscerally to the sounds in this range is because they are already really loud in many cases, and the human ear canal actually amplifies sounds in that range. This is obviously helpful for perceiving human speech, but if too loud, a source can become unpleasant and even perceived as painful. An acoustic engineer, Trevor Cox of the University of Salford, sums up, "It hits a range of frequency where your ear is particularly sensitive, and therefore you would expect a stronger response." Adding another significant piece to the puzzle, Sukhbinder Kumar et al. In 2012 published the results of their study, Features versus Feelings, Dissociable Representations of the Acoustic Features and Valence of Aversive Sounds. In it, they took fMRIs of a group of people listening to these types of sounds, among other more pleasant sounds like babbling water. In total, 74 different types of sounds were looked at. The results? Well, they found that when these sorts of nails on chalkboard sounds were perceived, not only did people rate these sounds as unpleasant, but the level at which they rated a given sound unpleasant was directly proportional to the activity of the amygdala and the auditory cortex. They also found that the activation of the amygdala in turn heightened the activation of the auditory processing centers of the brain, further making your brain pay even more attention to these sounds, and in this case, not in a pleasant way because of the activation of the amygdala. For those unfamiliar, the amygdala is, among many other interesting things we'll get into in the bonus facts in a bit, involved with emotional responses, including things like fear and, in turn, anxiety. On the note of fear, patients who have certain types of damage to the amygdala tend to fail to exhibit fear where others would, and animals who have the amygdala completely removed are drastically less likely to exhibit signs of fear and, in turn, anxiety. The amygdala is also thought to be the part of the brain that triggers the fight or flight response. Going back to sounds, the worst rated sounds, the ones that likewise showed the most activity between the amygdala and the auditory cortex, were a knife scraped on a bottle, a fork on a glass plate, and the screeching version of chalk on a chalkboard. And, if you're wondering, one of the most pleasantly rated sounds was that of a laughing baby. In the study, they further concurred that the troublesome parts of the sounds appear to be between 2000 and 5000 Hz. Dr. Kumar notes of this is the frequency range where our ears are most sensitive. Although there's still much debate on why our ears are most sensitive in this range, it does include sounds of screams, which we find intrinsically unpleasant. Speaking of screams, there is a certain dissonance to the sound of this sort of nails on a chalkboard scraping, which is also similar to the type of vibrations created when a baby is crying loudly, or indeed a non-parasite human screams. This perhaps all lends credence back to the original hypothesis in the 1986 study that there is something from our long past that has taught us to fear these sounds to the extent that our brains are apparently literally wired to induce anxiety and partially trigger the fight or flight response when they are perceived. As summed up by Dr. Kumar, it appears there is something very primitive kicking in. It's a possible distress signal from the amygdala to the auditory cortex. Thus, to sum up the answer to the question of why people hate the sound of nails on a chalkboard, for whatever reason, this triggers the amygdala to activate and interact with the auditory cortex of the brain, increasing its activation and creating an overall unpleasant sensation between the two. As to why, the working hypothesis to date is either because the sounds are being amplified in the ear canal to unpleasant levels, that the specific sounds in the offending range mimic that of a human screaming or a mini-human crying loudly, or possibly all of those combined. And speaking of mini-humans, while a baby crying is likewise one of the most unpleasant sounds, apparently in part from this amygdala activation, a baby laughing, as noted in the aforementioned 2012 study, is rated as one of the most pleasant to our brains, perhaps all giving at least one evolutionary benefit to why this is so encoded into our brains on both ends. And let's get into the bonus fact. While you might think all of this research on why humans hate the sound of nails on chalkboard is kind of trivial and a waste of research dollars and the time of some of the world's finest minds, Dr. Kumar takes the opposite line of thinking, saying that it has interesting implications on other research. For example, this may help shed some light into why, for example, autistic individuals are so much more sensitive to many sounds that others don't find offensive, with some such sounds causing extreme panic responses at times. This is even more noteworthy when connected to the fact that autistic people often exhibit a certain level of facial blindness and lack of ability to read emotional states of others by their facial expressions and the like. Why is this connection potentially important? It turns out, not just inducing certain anxiety responses from sounds, the amygdala also is integral in your ability to recognize the faces of people and their emotional state from this. Interestingly, the amygdala also plays a strong role in social interactions. For example, it's been found that the larger your amygdala, the more likely you are to have a larger and more diverse social sphere with many more connections than those with smaller amygdalas. The amygdala also plays a critical role in storing memories that occurred during emotional times, which is why you can remember those better. On a similar note, the amygdala also seems to play a role in learned aversion of certain things. So, for example, should you burn your hand in a fire, it becomes drilled into your brain to fear fire. For autistic people, this sort of learned anxiety seems to be turned on to overdrive at times, with a minor incident sometimes producing long-term anxiety about the situation in the future, even sometimes long after the original incident is forgotten. From all of this, there seems to be an awful lot of traits of autistic people that are potentially connected to the amygdala in some way. As one 2009 study from the University of Washington, heightened level of amygdala activity may cause social deficits in autism, notes, an increased pattern of brain activity in the amygdalas of adults with autism may be linked to the social deficits that typically are associated with the disorder. Previous research has shown that abnormal growth patterns in the amygdala are commonly found among young children diagnosed with autism. The researchers further note of the amygdala of autistic people, what we are seeing is hyperexcitability, or overarousal of the amygdala, which suggests that neurons in the amygdala are firing more than expected. If you consider that habituation reflects learning in as simple a task as looking at a face, slowness to habituate in people with autism may contribute even more markedly to difficulty with more complex social interactions and social cognition. If the brain is not reacting typically to a static face with a neutral expression, you can imagine how difficult it may be for someone with autism to pick up on more subtle social cues. They also found those autistic individuals with the highest overarousal of amygdala also exhibited the greatest social impairment. Going back to sounds, in the end, the results of this seemingly silly research on why humans are averse to the sounds of nails on a chalkboard is just another research log to throw on the fire of the growing body of evidence that there is something weird going on with autistic people's amygdalas and may well be a key contributor to many aspects of the condition. Most pertinent to the topic at hand, this potentially may point to why the nails on a chalkboard aversion extends to many other types of sounds, or even just to too much sound from a variety of sources in autistic people. Something similar may also be going on with visual stimulus. For example, vocal autistic people often describe looking people directly in the eyes when you talk to them as giving the same sensation as listening to the sound of nails on a chalkboard. And by the way, for those unfamiliar, it turns out the Spanish language has a word for this rather unique feeling, grima, which is often defined as disgust in English, but for whatever it's worth, one study done by the Complutense University of Madrid looking into the matter actually showed people's skin conductivity was noticeably different when feeling disgust at certain sounds versus the sensation when listening to nails on a chalkboard-like sounds, more or less concluding that this is an inaccurate translation and grima is a distinct, unpleasant sensation from disgust. That poor Grima Wormtongue in Lord of the Rings never had a chance with that first name, though apparently on this one it is widely reported that the first name was actually from the Old English for mask, though we couldn't find a primary source for this, and the Spanish word would make some sense here as well, unless anyone knows of Tolkien explaining the name origin or some other significant evidence either way. Moles in general are simply an abnormal grouping of cells called melanocytes. Melanocytes are the cells responsible for giving your skin its pigment. They reside in the basal layer of your skin and overall have a surprisingly uniform distribution. Their density will vary depending on the part of the body they reside in. For example, there are around 900 melanocytes per square millimeter on your back and around 1,500 per square millimeter around your genitals. During fetal development, their progression stops at the palms of your hands and the soles of your feet. They don't just reside in your skin, however, they're also found in the cochlea of your ear, the iris of your eye, and the part of your brainstem called your mesencephalon. When melanocytes group together, it's called a nest. These nests will show up as a mole. While it isn't fully understood why moles develop, it's known that most begin during fetal development. If you're born with a mole, it's termed congenital. About 1 in 100 people are born with congenital moles, and they'll vary greatly in size and shape depending on the person. Should your mole present itself after you're born, it's called an acquired mole. Acquired moles are so common that many researchers argue they shouldn't even be referred to as an abnormality. Almost everyone has at least one, and most people with light skin have between 10 and 40. No one has definitively shown why someone will acquire a mole, but there are risk factors such as increased exposure to UV light and many genetic causes, including mutations to certain types of genes. These types are usually round, symmetrical, and have the same color throughout, usually brown, tan, black, or red. Almost all are smaller than a pencil eraser. Both congenital and acquired moles are considered typical, and dermatologists generally note you shouldn't worry about them. Simply check them over time, noting their size, shape, and color as you age. If they do change significantly, it could be a sign of melanoma, or a cancer of your melanocytes, and thus such changes should be checked out by a professional. The higher number of moles you have, the greater your chance of getting melanoma. That is pretty much common sense, because the more you have, the greater chance one of them will start dividing at an uncontrolled rate. This brings us to atypical moles, also known as dysplastic nevus or Clark nevus. They're usually larger than a pencil eraser, tend to have shapes that aren't round, and will show more than one color, usually with mixed shades of brown, red, and pink. There are 3 main types of atypical moles, and they can also be either inherited or sporadically acquired. Since many melanomas are mutated from atypical moles, should you have these, check them occasionally. There is some confusion among doctors as to how often you should check them, because studies have consistently shown that about half of atypical moles will change over the course of 89 months, and they aren't a problem at all. The exact chance of having one of yours turn into something more sinister is still only about 1 in 200,000. Of course, while the risk is extremely low, since we're talking about cancer, if you're worried, get it checked. The three main types of atypical moles are spritz nevus, melanocytic nevus, and the dreaded melanoma. Melanocytic nevus are basically just moles that are classified as benign tumors. Note, they're named the same thing as typically acquired moles, but it seems the literature separates them out because they tend to be larger, appear later in life, and have somewhat specific causes. The exact mechanisms that make the grouping of melanocytes so large that they become tumors isn't fully known. It's thought that one ingredient might be from a type of growth factor released by a skin cell, keratinocyte, after a traumatic event, something like a second-degree burn, a severe sunburn, or any exposure to UV light, or disease processes like toxic epidermal necrolysis and epidermolysis bullosa. Even though men and women have the same rates of development, there does appear to be some involvement with sex hormones. It's known that pregnant women tend to have theirs darken or enlarge. They've also been shown to have receptors for two sex hormones, androgens and estrogens. Since melanocytic nevus responds to these hormones, it's thought the receptors are the reason. This brings us to spritz nevus. These little malformations are so similar to melanoma, most dermatologists can't distinguish them from their cancerous counterparts. Nearly all are dome-like and pink. Some, however, do have a red, black, or brown appearance and have been known to bleed or ooze. They normally occur in the first 20 years of life. Now to cancer. Melanoma, on average, kills 1 American every hour. In fact, the vast majority of people who die from skin cancer are those with melanoma. Melanoma cases are growing at an alarming rate. For women before the age of 44, it's increased annually by 6.1%, and overall melanoma rates have doubled in the US from 1982 to 2011. UV exposure is thought to be one of the biggest contributors to the increase. In fact, the use of a tanning bed before the age of 30 will increase your risk of getting melanoma by 75%. But even just with the sun, if you like baking like a cake, just stop doing that. No one wants leathery skin at 40 or a deadly disease, so use sunscreen, and for those trying to darken up, instead learn to accept you for you. As ever, it's not about the color of your skin, but the content of your character. Dead bodies don't have much character. The two main ways to get melanoma are genetic, or as stated previously, one of the moles you have turns against you and becomes cancerous. The overall risk of melanoma, if you're white, is about 1 in 150. The chance of a typical mole turning into melanoma is about 1 in 200,000. But your risk can reach as high as 100% if you have a condition called familial atypical multiple mole melanoma syndrome, or FAM. FAM is a problem in which someone has over 50 moles, usually many more, some are atypical, and have a blood relative who has melanoma. If you're freckled with moles like zits on a teenager, you might want to make sure you have a good dermatologist and then become best friends with them. As with all types of moles, the exact mechanism behind melanoma, or FAM, isn't exactly known. What has been shown is that those with melanoma have gene mutations, specifically changes to genes CDK2NA, CDK4, and CMM1. Interestingly, 3 mutated genes, PTEN, BRAF, and MCR1, are associated with melanoma, but not with people who have simple sporadic atypical moles. Some people who acquire melanoma from atypical moles will also have mutations to tumor-suppressing genes. No matter what genes are involved, every study shows that exposure to UV light will greatly increase your chance of having atypical moles that turn into melanoma. In the end, almost every light-skinned person on the planet has mold. The majority of people will never have to worry about anything ominous with them. But no matter the type, if you're worried about it at all, get it checked by a dermatologist. The 5-year survival rate for melanoma is 98% if it's caught before it spreads to your lymph nodes. Past that point, it decreases dramatically to around 18%. So keep tabs on your blemishes. If nothing else, it may give you an excuse to ask someone to stare at you naked. For your health. The effort put forth could then lead to a carnal reduction in the stress that you had about them in the first place. Now for some bonus facts. Melanin has 2 types of pigments, and they are essential in determining your hair color. Eumelanin, dark brown and black, and pheomelanin, yellow, red, and light brown. Along with melanin, the pigments involved in determining your skin color are hemoglobin, red, hemosiderin, brown, carotene, yellow, orange, or red, and bilin, yellow. And now for another bonus fact. The density of melanocytes on the palms of your hands and the soles of your feet is 5-fold less than other parts of your body. This is why even dark-complexioned people will have lighter palms and soles. At an average of around 60 to 100 times every minute of every day of every year of your ultimately meaningless life, your heart beats until it doesn't. Not long after it stops, all knowledge of your having ever existed is rapidly forgotten. Unlike the other muscles in your body, however, your heart steadfastly rages against the dying of the light, refusing to ever get tired. But how does it manage this, and why are your other muscles such slackers in comparison? To begin with, the human body is broadly composed of 3 types of muscles: skeletal, smooth, and cardiac. Skeletal muscles are striated, banded, and are what most of us think of when we envision a muscle. They control pretty much all voluntary and some involuntary body movement. Like cardiac muscle, skeletal muscle derives energy from ATP, adenosine we know you don't care. This is made in a few different ways. To avoid going full textbook on you, we'll just briefly give you the high-level, oversimplified view here. In a nutshell, the slowest but most efficient method of ATP production is via aerobic respiration, where mitochondria in your muscle cells draw energy from the dark dimension, producing ATP, a small amount of which is stored in your muscles at any given time. This stored amount is a sufficient supply to last for about 3 seconds of vigorous activity. After this supply is taxed with the ATP converted to ADP, adenosine diphosphate, in the process, creatine phosphate in the muscles is used to convert it back to ATP. This supply will last about 8 to 15 seconds. Next up, it turns out we were totally wrong about that whole dark dimension thing. In fact, your muscles continue to get ATP beyond this via a series of chemical reactions resulting in glucose being used to make the needed ATP to keep going. This glucose comes from a variety of sources, such as glycogen in your muscles, or via blood, via fats, protein, stores in the liver, and from your food churning away in your intestines. There are 2 high-level ways that this production of ATP ends up being accomplished. In the first, using large supplies of oxygen. In this case, as much as 38 ATP molecules can be produced for every glucose molecule. In the second case, via anaerobic glycolysis, not requiring oxygen, only 2 molecules of ATP are produced for each molecule of glucose. While an extremely inefficient use of the available supply of glucose, this method at least produces the ATP over 2 times faster than aerobic respiration and continues working for a time while you're out of breath. Due to glycolysis resulting in the accumulation of lactic acid in the muscles, ultimately, if it accumulates faster than it can be gotten rid of, it will interfere with the anaerobic glycolysis process, and your muscles are going to go all jelly and cease to work for a little bit. This is, in part, why if you get out of breath when exercising and your body is relying on more anaerobic glycolysis, you get fatigued extremely quickly. In this case, you're simultaneously creating lactic acid at a much more rapid rate and using up your available glucose molecules faster, but producing relatively small amounts of ATP for those molecules used. Do this for more than a minute or 2 and it will overtax your skeletal muscles' ability to produce the needed ATP at the rate you're using it. Though, again, your mileage will vary based on your current fitness level. Back it off so you're relying mostly on aerobic respiration, you're going to get the most bang for your buck, able to keep going a lot longer if you're hydrated and well fed. Unsurprisingly from all of this, the more mitochondria there are, the faster ATP can potentially be produced if the needed molecules are present. This means the muscle can keep on keeping on. As for skeletal muscle, about 2 to 8% of the volume of such muscle is mitochondria, though this varies somewhat from person to person, depending on your level of physical fitness. Moving on to smooth muscle, as you may have gleaned from the name, this is smooth with no striations. Found in your hollow internal organs, except for the heart, smooth muscle works automatically, helping you digest food, dilate your pupils, and take a wee-wee. As an example of smooth muscle in action, in digestion, the contractions themselves are really not too dissimilar to how your heartbeat works. Fluctuation of electrical potential in the smooth muscle cells, which causes the muscles to contract in a rhythmic fashion, in this case called the basic electrical rhythm, or BER. This rhythm is about 3 times per minute in the stomach and 12 times per minute in the small intestines. The sound you are hearing when your stomach and intestines make noise is the result of these muscular contractions mixing and moving chyme, the cocktail of digestive juices, food, microbes, etc., and air along down the tube between your mouth and your waste disposal port. As for the mitochondrial needs of these muscles, they are typically approximately that of your skeletal muscles, with mitochondria making up about 3 to 5% of the smooth muscle volume. This finally brings us to the real hero of your life story: cardiac muscle. Like skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle is striated, and like the other muscle in your body, is primarily powered by mitochondria. The cardiac muscles, however, have as much as 10 times the density of mitochondria as your other muscles, at about 35% of the volume of your cardiac muscle. It should also be noted that individual muscle cells in the heart actually do get regular rest thanks to how the heartbeat actually works, which we'll get into in a bonus fact in a moment. But the net result is that for about 60 to 70% of your life, a given part of your heart is actually in a resting state. Combining these micro-rests with the extreme amount of mitochondria and a large amount of oxygen from the heart's awesome blood supply, this allows your heart all the ATP it needs to not get tired, assuming you're not in an extreme state of starvation or doing some extreme form of exercise for extended periods well beyond your normal fitness regime. On that note, the downside to needing so much ATP thanks to no extended downtime is that the heart really needs to rely on aerobic respiration to make sure that it doesn't run out of ATP, and thus it doesn't take very long from oxygen being cut off for you to have a really bad time. Unlike other muscles, you can't just stop using the heart so it can recover. And yes, it turns out that the human heart can actually get tired and suffer damage if you're trying to do some extreme form of physical activity outside of your norm for lengthy periods, especially if in a low oxygen environment, like at a high altitude. In these cases, even the healthiest hearts can suffer damage, though given the other effects on your body of such extreme physical activity, typically most people will stop doing whatever they're doing before the heart is negatively impacted in a damaging way. In essence, your legs will give out before your heart does, usually, at least when talking about energy supply. But that doesn't mean in certain cases a measurable level of tiredness in the heart can't be observed. For example, in 2001, cardiologists studied a few dozen endurance athletes competing in a 400-kilometer race in Scotland, which comprised of all manner of physical activities from paddling, rope climbing, running, biking, climbing, etc., and the whole event took almost 100 hours. During this span, the athletes typically only slept about 1 hour per 24 hours during the event, and otherwise they just soldiered on. The results? Well, at the end of the race, the athletes' hearts were only pumping about 90% of the volume per beat that they'd been managing before the race started. Showing the resilience of the heart and its mitochondrial badassery, cardiologist Ewan Ashley, who was involved in the study, stated that the athletes' hearts that showed signs of cardiac fatigue did return to normal fairly quickly after the race, and no permanent damage was done. That said, further research on endurance athletes calls into question the notion of no permanent damage being done. For example, researchers involved in a 2011 British study looking at British Olympians who competed in distance running and rowing, and specifically competing in, at minimum, 100 events, found that as they aged, they showed marked signs of heart muscle scarring, something that can lead to irregular heart function and potentially heart failure. Of course, these are extreme examples, and for most people not doing ultra-marathons regularly or competing professionally or semi-professionally in endurance events, this is unlikely to be a problem, and the holistic health benefits of regular, vigorous exercise are likely to make up for it even then. So, stop sitting there watching this and go subscribe to our Brain Food Show podcast, where we talk about stuff like this in a long audio format. And while listening to that, pick up something heavy, put it back down again, repeat that, or go for a run or something. The benefits to your life are astounding, positively affecting just about every facet of your life and typically making it a lot longer and more enjoyable too. Your future or present grandkids are worth getting to know. And let's get into the bonus fact. Ever wonder how heartbeat works? Well, want to know more? In a nutshell, the heart is a 4-chambered pump. The 2 top chambers are called atria and the bottom 2 are called ventricles. They are separated from top to bottom by valves. The right and left sides are separated by a septum. So what makes the pump squeeze? When the heart muscle gets shocked, it will contract and force the blood down its path, with the valves not allowing blood to flow back through the system unless they are defective. The blood's path through the heart starts in the vein called the superior vena cava. Then it enters the right atrium, flows through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. From there, it travels through the pulmonic valve into the pulmonary arteries, then into the lungs. Now back to the heart and into the left atrium through the mitral valve. The blood is now in the strongest chamber of the heart, the left ventricle. From there, it gets pumped through the aortic valve and into the aorta and out to the rest of the body. So what causes that infamous electrical shock that the heart receives approximately 60 to 100 times a minute? Short answer, that's the Dormammu. Long answer, the exchange of electrolytes across specialized cells within the heart builds up a differing electrical potential on either side of the cell. When this electrical potential reaches a certain level, it discharges and sends a shock down another unique set of cells within the heart, causing a shock and thus the contraction. The specific set of cells that regulates the heart rate in most people are called the sinoatrial node, or SA node for short. The SA node, the pacemaker of the heart, sits in the upper portion of the right atria near the entrance of the superior vena cava. When the SA node sends out an electrical shock, it immediately shocks the atria. The pulse then gets held up in another set of cells called the atrioventricular node, or AV node for short. This then transmits the impulse down to the bundle of His and then to two pathways called the right and left bundle branches. Then it's transmitted to the rest of the ventricles through what are called the Purkinje fibers. Altogether, this shock causes the atria to contract, then the ventricles, and you're still alive, at least for now. So what and how do these electrolytes cause this shock? In an attempt not to give a physiology lecture of ungodly proportions, we will simply say that the main two electrolytes involved are sodium and potassium. Potassium normally sits inside the cell and sodium outside it. Potassium slowly leaks outside of the cell and sodium then goes inside the cell. This creates the differing electrical potential that builds up until the point of discharge. Other electrolytes also help in creating this differential, and they are calcium and magnesium. Altogether, the harmony created by this yin and yang system of electrical and mechanical systems come together to make that wonderfully thumping thing inside your chest. It's often said that it's impossible to put a price on a human life, but that doesn't necessarily mean you can't define it by other metrics, something physician Duncan McDougall tried to do in the early 20th century by setting up an experiment to discern the weight of a single human soul. And his answer? Well, it was a mere 21 grams. So, how did he come up with this figure, and is there any validity to his study? Further, do people really suddenly lose about 21 grams of weight upon their death? As to the man himself, Duncan McDougall's life before his famed experiment has largely been lost to history, other than that he was born sometime in 1866. As for the experiment, this occurred sometime in 1901 while he was a physician working in Haverhill, Massachusetts. A 1907 article covering his study by the New York Times notes that McDougall was the head of the Research Society at the time and that he was reputable, but it fails to give any further detail on his background. The only other thing we really know for sure is that McDougall was a religious man, though again we have no real idea what particular religious ideology he ascribed to, only that he postulated that dogs do not have souls, something which we're going to come back to later. McDougall was apparently obsessed with the idea that the human soul, if indeed did exist, would have some kind of quantifiable mass that could be measured. To quote the man himself, "We are therefore driven back upon the assumption that the soul substance so necessary to the conception of continuing personal identity after the death of this material body must still be a form of gravitative matter, or perhaps a middle form of substance, neither gravitative matter or ether, not capable of being weighed and yet not identical with ether. Since, however, the substance considered in our hypothesis is linked organically with the body until death takes place, it appears to me more reasonable to think that it must be some form of gravitative matter and therefore capable of being detected at death by weighing a human being in the act of death." Towards this end, McDougall sought to measure the weight of the soul by placing people dying of terminal illnesses upon a specially constructed set of scales designed like a bed. McDougall reported in his findings that the scales constructed for the experiment were accurate to within 0.2 of an ounce, which is about 5 grams. As for his subjects, he sought out patients who were dying of tuberculosis because it seemed to me best to select a patient dying with a disease that produces great exhaustion, the death occurring with little or no muscular movement, because in such a case the beam could be kept more perfectly at balance and any loss occurring readily noted. In the end, McDougall found 6 patients for his study, but only 4 ended up being useful, and they were all men. As for the other 2, one was a woman in a diabetic coma, and the other was a man with an undisclosed illness. However, neither result could be counted, as the woman died before accurate measurements could be taken due to quote him, interference by people opposed to our work. As for the man, he died within 5 minutes of being put on the scales, which wasn't enough time for McDougall to balance everything correctly. So what about the other 4 patients? Well, McDougall carefully observed each one, meticulously noting every drop in weight from perspiration and respiratory moisture over time as to properly account for this as he waited for them to die. And if you're wondering, as a sort of follow-up to our video, do people really defecate after death, and if so, how often does it occur? Some of the patients urinated and or defecated in their final moments, which McDougall left where it was to not throw off any measurements. After accounting for the loss of weight due to evaporation, McDougall and his team found that at the apparent moment of death, the first patient suddenly lost about 3/4 of an ounce, that's 21.3 grams. This couldn't be accounted by anything else they could think of. To quote his paper on the subject, this loss of weight could not be due to evaporation of respiratory moisture and sweat, because that had already been determined to go on, in his case, at the rate of 1/60th of an ounce per minute, whereas this loss was sudden and large, 3/4 of an ounce in a few seconds. The bowels did not move. If they had moved, the weight would still have remained upon the bed, except for a slow loss by the evaporation of moisture, depending, of course, upon the fluidity of the feces. The bladder evacuated 1 or 2 grams of urine. They remained upon the bed and could only have influenced the weight by slow, gradual evaporation, and therefore in no way could account for the sudden loss. There remains but one more channel of loss to explore: the expiration of all the residual air in the lungs. Getting upon the bed myself, my colleague put the beam at actual balance. Inspiration and expiration of air as forcibly as possible by me had no effect upon the beam. My colleague got upon the bed and I placed the beam at balance. Forcible inspiration and expiration of air on his part had no effect. In this case, we certainly have an inexplicable loss of weight of 3/4 of an ounce. Is it the soul substance? How other shall we explain it? The other 3 patients exhibited a similar loss of weight, but one patient put the weight back on somehow and the other 2 randomly lost weight again a few minutes later. The good doctor noted, however, that in these cases it was much more difficult to determine exactly when the people expired than in the first case. For example, with subject 2, he states, "The last 15 minutes he had ceased to breathe, but his facial muscles still moved convulsively, and then, coinciding with the last movement of the facial muscles, the beam dropped." This patient was of a totally different temperament from the first. His death was very gradual, so that we had great doubts from the ordinary evidence to say just what moment he died. Nevertheless, now convinced it demonstrated that the human soul has weight, he moved on to test to see if dogs had souls, which he suspected they didn't. McDougall tested this by repeating the experiment on 15 dogs and noted that no similar drop in weight occurred at the instant of doggy death. Sadly, Dr. McDougall states, the ideal tests on dogs would be obtained in those dying from some sort of disease that rendered them much exhausted and incapable of struggle. It was not my fortune to get dogs dying from such sickness. Thus, to get the desired result, he used drugs to make sure that dogs laid still and ultimately died. He went on to publish the results of his experiments in the April of 1907 edition of American Medicine in a paper titled Hypothesis Concerning Soul Substance, together with experimental evidence of the existence of such substance. Catchy title. Around the same time, the New York Times got wind of McDougall's experiments and reported on them as well. The story was global news, and even today people continue to cite McDougall's experiment as definitive proof of the existence of the soul, popularly quoting his 3/4 of an ounce figure as 21 grams. Much as with scientists today, who almost always see their studies inaccurately represented as far more definitive than they actually are in media and in the public consciousness, McDougall, well, he had this happen too. This was despite that in his paper he explicitly stated, "I am aware that a large number of experiments would require to be made before the matter can be proved beyond any possibility of error." This, of course, is a sentiment echoed by countless scientists in the century since McDougall published his findings. In the end, while the weight variance over time in the 4 human subjects is fascinating, regardless of whether one is considering souls, his study was far too limited to draw any clear conclusions. In addition, experts have criticized the accuracy of the equipment that McDougall used, as well as the fact that only one patient gave marked results, with the others having additional weight variances that couldn't be explained by the soul hypothesis unless they had multiple souls coming and going. Yet McDougall casually dismissed that variance and made his results fit his hypothesis. There's also the inherent difficulty of determining the exact moment of death. In truth, the death of a body is a long and drawn-out process. Some who believe humans have souls have also raised the question of how exactly one knows when a soul leaves the body in the first place. After all, plenty of people have been declared clinically dead, even with modern advanced medical equipment, only to be revived later, in certain hypothermic cases, sometimes a long while later, leading to the common expression among medical professionals, "not dead until warm and dead." Further, as our resident paramedic author and host of the fantastic Medical Confessions podcast noted in a video we did about how long a person's heart has to be stopped before medics wouldn't try and revive them, he said, "I can tell you the longest I have ever personally seen a person's heart not beating and they were able to be successfully revived, meaning they walked out of the hospital with somewhat normal neurological function, was over 40 minutes. For more on all that, do check out that video, and if you like it, why not subscribe to the Medical Confessions podcast and their YouTube channel? It's really good. So in these cases, does the soul leave and then come back, or does it stick around to see how things are going to work out? As for McDougall, he defines the moment of death, or more aptly, the moment when the soul would leave the body, as being virtually at the instant of the last breath, though in persons of sluggish temperament, it may remain in the body for a full minute. As you might imagine, McDougall's experiments on humans have never been repeated for ethical reasons, though it is interesting that pretty much every other thing is monitored and tabulated when a person dies, so we suppose if hospitals simply started making hospital beds accurate scales too, nobody would mind very much, but nobody has done that yet. That said, others have attempted the same type of experiments on various animals with mixed results. In one study with mice, the results of McDougall's dog experiments were confirmed. Apparently, mice don't have souls either. Curiously, in at least one experiment published in the Journal of Scientific Exploration in 2001, Unexplained Weight Gain Transients at the Moment of Death, it was found that 7 adult sheep involved actually saw an inexplicable rise in body weight for a brief period of 1 to 6 seconds directly after their heart stopped, before the weight would once again return to normal. This did not occur in the lambs used in the study, nor the goat. What might have caused this is presently unknown, but it was fascinatingly consistent across all 7 adult sheep. Going back to McDougall's experiment, as to what caused the clear drop around the time the subject in question died, this isn't clear, though as noted by the random weight fluctuations on the other subjects, seemingly at random times, most point to simply that his equipment wasn't as precise as McDougall thought it was, and perhaps it was just prone to variance at the slightest provocation, such as if the individual in question had moved slightly upon death. As for McDougall, he never attempted to replicate the experiment, instead turning his attention to trying to find ways to photograph the soul at the moment of death using X-rays. These experiments, if they ever occurred, apparently never went anywhere, as he never published any findings. As for the man himself, he lost his own 21 grams in 1920 at the age of 54 without making any further progress or impact on the scientific world. Nonetheless, the results of his experiment live on, and there are still many people today who believe the soul has a mass of 21 grams because of his studies. This is something we're guessing they'd not be so keen to cite if they knew the same experiments apparently also conclusively proved that doggy heaven doesn't exist. And now for a bonus fact. If we were actually able to convert matter perfectly to energy, with 1 kilogram of matter being completely annihilated, the energy produced from just that small amount of matter is equivalent to about 42.95 megatons of TNT. So an adult male weighing in at around 200 pounds, or about 90 kilograms, has somewhere in the vicinity of 4,000 megatons of TNT potentially in their matter if they were completely annihilated. This is about 80 times more energy than was produced by the largest ever detonated nuclear bomb, the Tsar bomber, which itself produced a blast of around 1,400 times more powerful than the combined explosions of the bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. To further illustrate, 1 megaton of TNT, when converted to kilowatt hours, makes enough electricity to power an average American home for about 100,000 years. It's also enough to power the entire United States for a little over 3 days. So 1 kilogram of some matter being completely annihilated would be enough to power the entire United States for about 4 months. One average adult male, then, when completely annihilated, would produce enough energy to power the United States for about 30 years if fully utilized. On a completely baffling scale, the typical supernova explosion will give off the equivalent of, well, I'll put the number up on screen, but that's a 10 followed by 27 zeros, and that's the number of megatons of TNT that come out of a supernova. Pretty incredible. Art, as they say, is subjective. What one person considers a priceless masterpiece, others might see nothing more than a giant black square. But there's one very specific kind of painting that most everyone sees the same way. The kind with the weird eyes that seem to follow you around the room. So, well, what causes this optical illusion of sorts, and how do artists achieve this effect? It turns out, for even a moderately skilled artist, this ubiquitous gaze effect isn't a difficult thing to achieve at all. In a nutshell, all you need is a little little bit of illusion of depth. So the person being depicted appears somewhat 3D despite being on a 2D canvas, and to direct the gaze of the eyes such that they would be looking at someone standing right in front of the picture. So, well, what exactly is going on here in our brains that then makes it seem like the eyes follow you even if you move away from being front and center? Well, as demonstrated in 2004 by a team of researchers from Ohio State University, as you move from one side to the other, the near and far points of the 2D image don't really change. These near and far points are defined as visible points that, if the image was three-dimensional, would appear nearest and furthest away from the viewer at a given angle. Summarizing their findings, co-author of the paper James Todd had the following to say: "The idea is simple. No matter what angle you look at the painting from, the painting itself doesn't change. You're looking at a flat surface. The key is that the near points and the far points of the picture remained the same no matter the angle the picture was viewed from. When observing real surfaces in the natural environment, the visual information that specifies near and far points varies when we change viewing direction. When we observe a picture on the wall, on the other hand, the visual information that defines near and far points is unaffected by viewing direction. Still, we interpret this perceptually as if it were a real object. Thus, because the perspective, shadows, and light on the painting don't change as you move around, if the eyes in the painting would be staring directly at the observer if said individual is standing in front of the painting, it creates something of a mild optical illusion in your brain such that the eyes will continue to seem to stare at you as you move to the side. In contrast to the eyes following you trick, if the artist tweaks the painting a bit such that the eyes are looking off somewhere else instead of directly out at a potential observer, no matter where you stand, the eyes will never seem to be looking at you." So this technique first began popularly showing up in art around the 14th century when the artist and architect Filippo Brunelleschi introduced the art world to the idea of linear perspective. Linear perspective is painting with the idea of everything in the picture converging on a specific point on the horizon, creating the illusion of depth. This, combined with skilled use of light and shadow, allowed artists to create masterfully realistic paintings, including sometimes of people that stare at you creepily no matter where you stand and totally aren't Scooby-Doo villains stalking you with the intent to later murder you in your sleep. And let's get on with the bonus facts. Speaking of one of the most valuable paintings in history being just a black square on a white canvas, in 1964, a new avant-garde artist was introduced to the art scene in the Swedish city of Göteborg. This fresh new artist was Pierre Brasseau, and his work received absolutely rave reviews from critics as well as art fans. One critic in particular, Rolf Anderberg, was so overwhelmed by Pierre's talent that he wrote the following review about his work, which appeared in print the morning after the exhibition. "Brasseau paints with powerful strokes, but also with clear determination. His brush strokes twist with furious fastidiousness. Pierre is an artist who performs with the delicacy of a ballet dancer." The reviews, they were almost universally glowing. All but one, that is. One critic's commentary on the new artist was short and to the point. "Only an ape could have done this." That dissenting opinion was unpopular, despite the fact that the art looked surprisingly like the art that you would see stuck to a refrigerator. It turns out, though, that ape review more or less hit it on the head. Pierre Brasseau was actually none other than a young West African chimpanzee named Peter, who lived in the Borås Djurpark Zoo in Sweden. The mastermind behind the hoax was one journalist called Åke Axelsson. Axelsson worked for a Swedish tabloid and came up with the idea of featuring the primate paintings in an exhibition in order to put the critics to the test. Could they distinguish between the work of true, highly skilled avant-garde modern artists when compared to the work of a random chimpanzee? It turns out the answer is mostly no. Although we should note here that the chimp probably wouldn't have been able to paint a perfect black square, so I guess there's that. And if you're wondering, once the hoax was revealed, the critic who had previously compared Pierre Brasseau with a ballet dancer, Rolf Anderberg, doggedly stuck by his assessment and stated that Pierre's work was still the best painting in the exhibition. A notion that will come as a surprise to just about no one is that most people think soda and other carbonated drinks taste significantly better when they still contain a lot of fizz as opposed to when they are flat. It turns out that, contrary to popular belief, this phenomenon has nothing to do with bubbles popping on your tongue or anything like that. In fact, when people drink carbonated beverages in a highly pressurized environment where no bubbles can form, they report no real difference in flavor of the drink. So, why do many fizzy drinks taste better than than their flat equivalents? Well, it's simply because the carbonic acid H2CO3 created via adding carbon dioxide CO2 to the drink, which obviously in turn contains H2O, actually has a tangible taste that your tongue can detect and which accents the flavor of the beverage. Thus, as these beverages are designed to taste good in their carbonated form, removing the flavor imparted by the CO2 is usually going to negatively impact the taste. Of course, this doesn't inherently mean a worse overall flavor for any liquid that is not carbonated versus the same drink that is. But because many carbonated beverages, like popular sodas, tend to have a lot of sugar or equivalent artificial sweetener, when the CO2 is removed, the extreme sweet flavor ends up standing out quite a bit more, usually more than most people enjoy. The net result of all of this is many people not enjoying the taste of flat sodas. On a similar note, in order to narrow down the mechanisms behind the taste derived from carbonating beverages, researchers use mice that have been genetically modified to not be able to taste variously sweet, umami, salty, bitter, and sour. What they found was that those mice that could not taste sour did not react to carbonation, while all the others did. Examining why CO2 triggers sour-tasting receptors, the researchers hypothesized, correctly as it turns out, that a special enzyme on the surface of sour-tasting cells, carbonic anhydrase 4, also known as CAR4, might be the culprit. Once again, experimenting on modified mice, this time removing only the CAR4 but not the entire sour-tasting cell, they found that gustatory responses to CO2 were severely reduced, but responses to other taste stimuli, including sour, were unaltered. And now for a bonus fact. While manufacturers put the same amount of CO2 in cans as bottles of soda, when placed in plastic, which is more permeable to CO2, the carbonation will dissipate relatively quickly over time. In fact, if stored in direct sunlight, in 3 months, soda in plastic can lose up to 15% of its carbonation. Cans of soda, on the other hand, can have their taste affected by bits of metal that are dissolved from the inner lining, and again, the warmer the container, the greater the effect. This is one of the reasons many people have preferences when drinking soda from glass versus plastic versus metal containers. Springtime is a time of year when tissue companies nationwide rejoice at the excessive mucus caused by allergies. If you're one of the unlucky, you might ask yourself, why do we get these anyway? Why would our immune system react to seemingly harmless things like pollens, dust mites, and the dander from cats and dogs? Well, there are two proposed theories here. The most widely accepted involves an evolutionary mechanism for expelling parasitic worms, a frequent problem for our ancestors before the advent of modern medicine and potentially living in a more hygienic environment. A relatively newly suggested competing theory is that the reaction is due to how the immune system responds to a type of cell known as a mast cell when it releases its chemicals of inflammation. Before we can understand the two theories, it is important to know how the immune system works in general when it encounters a potential allergen. There are two ways that it can deal with a foreign pathogen. There's option 1, and that's called a type 1 reaction. That's essentially kill it. Or there's option 2, which is expel it from the body, and that's called a type 2 reaction. Fairly obvious. Should you have a large pathogen, say like a parasitic worm, the body would generally elicit the type 2 expulsion tactic. A smaller microbe like a bacteria or a virus will generally trigger the type 1 kill response. So what exactly is happening when the immune system is stimulated? And in order to avoid essentially writing a book on this topic, we're only going to touch on the parts pertaining to allergies themselves and not the immune system as a whole. All the cells of your immune system revolve around a class of cells called white blood cells. One type of white blood cells is a B cell. B cells have antibodies on their surface which are known as immunoglobulins, Ig. They are Y-shaped proteins. When an allergen contacts your skin, eye, nasal passage, mouth, airway, or in your digestive tract, it will attach to the antibody on the B cell. The B cell will then become activated. Alright, so once activated, they will begin to multiply. Some turn into memory B cells that will recognize the same molecule later in life and be able to more quickly mount a defense. Some turn into plasma B cells, effector cells. These make more identical antibodies that attach to the molecule its predecessor just recognized. They're so good at it that one effector cell can produce about 2,000 identical antibodies every single second. Those antibodies will then attach to the invader and mark it for recognition by other white blood cells that will destroy the suspicious molecule. They do this by attaching themselves in a process called ospanization. Different allergens will end up producing different antibodies. In 1967, two research groups from Colorado and from Sweden identified a new type of Ig known as IgE. This little antibody proved to be the main force starting a cascade of events that leads to those sinister allergy symptoms. More recently, scientists have been able to genetically engineer mice to stop making IgE, and those mice do not get allergies. Win for science. In any event, once produced, IgE begins circulating around the body and attaches to the receptors Fc type 1 and type 2 on the previously mentioned mast cell. These cells are responsible for most of the processes involved in the symptoms you feel when you're suffering from allergies. When stimulated, they begin secreting a barrage of chemicals called degranulation. One example is the release of histamine. Histamine is important for several of our allergic reaction symptoms, things like the constriction of bronchioles, the dilation of your arteries, the perception of itching, and the production of hives. It's also responsible for many of the processes involved with inflammation. So, to sum up on how, or at least how it's generally understood, there is some controversy here as we'll get into in a moment. An allergen enters the body, attaches to B cells, IgE is created and stimulates mast cell degranulation, inflammation ensues, and all the symptoms you feel begin causing their web of woe. The immune system, it stays activated until it senses no more allergen to attack, and with that, you're back to normal. Alright, so that's the how covered. Now let's jump to the bit about why we get allergies to things that are seemingly harmless. Now, no one has definitively answered this question, but everyone does seem to agree that IgE is the main antibody responsible for all the immune system reactions and the inflammation that it brings. So, what in natural selection made IgE an important trait required for our ancestors' survival, given today some consider it mostly useless and more than a little annoying? Until recently, the leading theory revolved around parasitic worms. In 1964, scientist Bridget Ogilvy showed that IgE was found to be in abundance in rats that were infected with worms. Our ancestors also had a problem with worms. They didn't have access to modern medicine and hygienic environments that have reduced the infection rate down to the current 20% worldwide, with most that are infected residing in underdeveloped countries. Throughout much of history, everything from roundworms such as hookworms to flatworms like tapeworms and liver flukes were relatively common. IgE and the symptoms it creates, like sneezing, coughing, and diarrhea, all serve to expel those nasty little freeloaders. As Dr. David Dunn from the University of Cambridge states, you've got about an hour to react very dramatically in order to reduce the chance of these parasites surviving. Allergy is just an unfortunate side effect of defense against parasitic worms. So, IgE's ability to kick things into high gear to quickly react to such an invader would seemingly be very handy here. Alright, so this brings us to another question, and that's what exactly do parasitic worms have to do with allergies? I mean, get to the point, Simon. The idea here is that the reason we get such a strong reaction to certain other less threatening things that our immune system might be better off ignoring is that the proteins on the surface of parasitic worms are similar to the molecules we encounter in other aspects of our lives. The B cells responsible for the immediate immune system response react to a non-specific class of molecules. Thus, our immune system will respond to allergens that are structurally similar to the proteins found on the surface of worms. The body then attempts to rid itself of them, whether they are harmful or not. The leftover response from our immune system reacting to worms and now similar protein molecules is why allergies continue to torment landscapers everywhere, or at least this is how this theory goes. While it is a long-standing theory and it's widely accepted in the medical world, the defense against worms philosophy gets somewhat undermined when you look at studies showing IgE isn't actually strictly necessary to fight them off. The mice scientists have genetically engineered to be unable to produce IgE are still able to rid themselves of the parasites. That's not to mention the fact that people can have these types of allergic reactions to things that have no possible biological link to any protein found on a worm, such as reacting to the metal nickel. So even if this is a factor in why we have allergic responses to seemingly otherwise harmless things, it can't tell the whole story. So this brings us to the slightly newer theory as to why we have allergies. It also involves the idea of our bodies attempting to expel allergens, but instead of the immune system recognizing a structurally similar protein molecule to that on parasitic worms and misinterpreting that the body has acquired such a parasite, it is the immune system reacting to actual damage caused by that invader, namely the destruction of those mast cells. When mast cells begin to degranulate, the body begins making antibodies to several of the proteins around the area affected to try to get rid of whatever foreign agent is there. Should it inadvertently make an antibody to, for instance, the proteins found on peanuts, you will get memory B cells to fight against peanut molecules in the future. And congratulations, you now potentially have a peanut allergy. Dr. Ruslan Medzitov, professor of immunology at Yale University School of Medicine and arguably the biggest promoter of this theory, likes to think of it like how we protect our homes. If you're not home and someone breaks into your house, your alarm system won't go off based on recognizing the intruder's face, but by the fact that they broke a window. So, in a nutshell, it's not recognizing the molecule, but rather simply creating antibodies for things around mast cells degranulating. In support of this theory, Dr. Medzitov and co. began investigating potential cell damage caused by various allergens. For instance, when they injected mice with an allergen found in honeybee venom, PLA2, they found that their immune systems did not initially respond at all to the PLA2 itself. It wasn't until the PLA2 ripped open the cell membranes that the immune system kicked into gear, producing IgE as a rapid response mechanism. And as previously mentioned, other pathogens in the area might potentially get implicated as the house burglar, with your immune system creating the memory B cells to react to it later. Fascinatingly, no matter which side of the why we get allergies debate you're on, or even if you think both ideas are partially correct or both incorrect, one thing almost all researchers agree on is that allergy rates are increasing. For instance, nearly 30% of adults and 40% of children in the US are affected by some sort of allergy. So why is this? Well, we've known for a long time that both genetics and the environment play an important part in why we get allergies. Technology has also allowed us to create countless never-before-seen synthetic chemicals. These chemicals could trigger any number of reactions by the immune system that our ancestors didn't have to worry about. This is perhaps one factor in why there are increased allergy rates. Another potential factor is something known as the hygiene hypothesis. Many scientists believe that with the promotion of good hygiene taught throughout the industrialized world, which most definitely does have an amazing number of significant benefits, there may also be a downside in that children aren't being exposed to as many pathogens that their immune systems can learn to respond to correctly, or some even postulate potentially need to respond to develop the immune system properly. The idea in the latter case is that for most of human evolution, the immune system developed being exposed to these pathogens as a matter of course, and similar to how we've evolved to need many types of microbes in the digestive system to survive, the idea goes that the human immune system perhaps has evolved to need to be exposed to certain things in order that it later correctly responds to introduced pathogens rather than triggering an allergic response to things that it might be better off ignoring. Thus, the immune system later in life overreacts to some things, or sometimes even reacts to parts of the body itself. Potentially supporting evidence put forth in support of this idea is the similar massive rise in not only allergy rates but of various autoimmune diseases. In both cases, there hasn't been a corresponding rise in allergy and autoimmune disease rates in individuals from underdeveloped countries who get exposure to various pathogens, more similar to how our ancestors throughout history did. On the flip side, children who live in urban environments, and particularly those without siblings, have the highest allergy rates of all. Of course, that exposure to pathogens does come with a cost in things like higher childhood mortality rates from said exposure and things like that. So even if the hygiene hypothesis is correct, it would appear there's something of a trade-off. As is now presumably abundantly clear to you, no matter how we get allergies, the why is unfortunately still the topic of hot debate, with little in the way of concrete answers currently available. But whether you subscribe to the recognition worm theory or the alarm system protecting your house theory, rest assured that IgE, once thought to be mostly useless outside of its aid in expelling parasitic worms, but now thought by some to play a significant beneficial role in early recognition and reaction to various pathogens, is the molecule responsible for all the madness. Some bonus facts. Along the lines of the idea that the immune system needs to be exposed to certain things to properly develop, one proposed treatment for certain allergies and autoimmune disorders is simply introducing parasitic worms to the body, known as Helminthic therapy. This therapy usually uses worms that have limited negative long-term impact on the human body, and in some cases ones that will be naturally expelled in due course. While research in this area is still very much in the preliminary stages, the early results in some cases have been promising enough to warrant continued research. For instance, as noted in one survey paper on the subject, in initial safety studies, patients with ulcerative colitis, UC, or Crohn's disease were given viable embryonated T. suis eggs, TSO, and not only was the treatment well tolerated, but a significant disease remission was observed, and although the beneficial effect was temporary, repeated doses of TSO sustained this clinical improvement, suggesting a promising new therapy for IBD. However, it goes on to note that after many other studies looking at this therapy for various immune conditions, most of the experimental data available suggest that once the allergic reaction is established, helminth infections can do little to alter this, raising the inevitable question whether there is any true benefit to gain from helminth therapy in already allergic individuals. If you've ever been subjected to watching The Notebook with your spouse, you might have experienced an uncomfortable lump in your throat as you attempt to breathe heavy and avoid crying like a little kid who just skinned his knee. You might wonder, well, what causes the feeling of that lump in your throat? And for that matter, why do we cry when we're sad? The lump in your throat has a rather easy explanation compared to crying when emotionally upset. Known as the globus sensation, the feeling is the result of a battle between the opposing forces of muscles attached to your glottis, the opening between your vocal cords. It tends to present itself when sad or when you swallow or hold your breath in order to avoid crying. There are only two autonomic nervous systems in your body, sympathetic and parasympathetic. Sympathetic being your fight or flight nervous system, and the opposing parasympathetic being stimulated by resting and relaxing, your feed and breed nervous system. When you begin feeling upset or have any stressful experience, your body stimulates its sympathetic nervous system via the HPA axis. This axis involves a connection between your hypothalamus, pituitary gland, and your adrenal glands. It will release hormones into your bloodstream, causing things like increased heart rate, blood pressure, and metabolism. It will then sense it needs more oxygen to maintain that experience. It's your sympathetic nervous system at work when you try to avoid breaking down and it feels like you've swallowed a golf ball. Your body responds to this sympathetic drive by opening your glottis via the posterior cricoarytenoid and thyroarytenoid muscles. The result gives a larger opening for oxygen to enter your lungs. When you try to hold your breath to avoid sobbing, your lateral cryoarytenoid, aryepiglottic, and thyroepiglottic muscles constrict, struggling to close off your glottis. These opposing forces cause the sensation of a giant lump in your throat. Crying, or more specifically shedding tears in response to an emotional stimulus, well, that's a much more complex issue. To begin with, tears are produced by the almond-shaped lacrimal glands located on the outside portion of your orbit. Depending on the type of stimulus, the glands will produce three different tears. The first kind are basal tears. They get released every time you blink, serving to lubricate the eye and keep it free from dust or from drying out. The second type are reflex tears. They get released in response to an irritant, such as can be introduced when cutting onions. And if you want to learn more about that, we got a link below to another video we did called Does Cutting Onions Make Your Eyes Water? Fascinating stuff. Check it out. Well, these two types of tears are composed of pretty much the same stuff, things like water, salt, potassium, lipids, and the antibacterial lysozyme. Emotional tears are a different thing altogether. There doesn't seem to be a consensus among researchers as to exactly why they spring up. Their makeup does, however, provide some clues as to their origin. For instance, they contain hormones like ACTH, adrenocorticotrophin hormone, and prolactin, 20 to 25% more protein groups and 30 times more manganese than normal tears. ACTH is the hormone released by your HPA axis when your sympathetic nervous system is in charge. Prolactin is also elevated in response to stress. Manganese has long been known to help regulate your mood, and those who are constantly depressed will usually have higher levels in their bloodstream. Emotional tears also contain leucine enkephalin. This is an opioid peptide giving you the same pain-killing effect that morphine does. On that note, some posit that crying in response to having your sympathetic nervous system stimulated by an emotional event has evolutionary benefits, in that it's a way for humans to signal the need for help during trying times. Or perhaps empathy, as in the case of James Garner's character Noah when his children ask him to come home as his wife and their mother doesn't recognize him or know he's there anyway. In response, he says, "Look guys, that's my sweetheart in there. I'm not leaving her. This is my home now. Your mother is my home." If this is true, then the presence of ACTH and prolactin could account for that. Women generally have higher levels of prolactin in their bodies, so this could be the reason why women cry on average 5 times more than men. Chronically depressed people seem to cry more often, and they also tend to have higher levels of manganese in their system. Others point out the healing benefits of the act as the main reason why we cry. First off, there is the aforementioned presence of leucine and kephalin, giving you the mood-lifting feelings that any opiate would. Secondly, there are plenty of studies showing the calming effects of crying, leading many to argue it's an involuntary way our bodies can calm down from a stressful event. This theory is furthered by studies showing that if you disable nerves that stimulate the sympathetic nervous system, you will cry more. Should you damage the important nerves involved with the parasympathetic nervous system, you will cry less. This would lead one to conclude that it's not the stressful event that triggers the crying, but the need for our ancestors to calm down after a stressful event, helping to make sure they don't die of a heart attack from the continual fight or flight response. As any barrister beginning their 5 a.m. shift will tell you, a morning cup of coffee is essential for a chipper attitude and a healthy psyche. The dilemma some have is that right after you indulge, it hits you. The number 2 train is about to arrive and you don't want to be stuck in traffic when it does. In fact, coffee's effect on the colon is on par with eating a 1,000-calorie meal. It's also interesting to note that the reaction is not volume or temperature dependent. Women are more susceptible to these effects than men, 53% for women and 19% for men. And of those affected, 58% reported the reaction would only occur if they had not already evacuated their bowels, and 52% state that the reaction only occurs in the morning. So what exactly is going on here? A commonly touted theory is that the caffeine inside of coffee is the culprit. After all, caffeine's effects on your gastrointestinal tract have been known for quite some time. More specifically, one theory about the exact mechanisms that may be causing this concerns how caffeine stimulates your central nervous system, stimulating your sympathetic nervous system, your fight and flight nervous system, with the net result being the constriction of your blood vessels. Normally responsive to low oxygen levels, a grouping of cells called chemoreceptors can get stimulated by this constriction. Indirectly, this will have a response affecting your vagus nerve. The vagus nerve can stimulate part of your parasympathetic nervous system, your rest and digest nervous system, which increases the rhythmic contractions within the colon. Thus, taking in caffeine may result in an increase in your gastric motility, known as peristalsis. In layman's terms, this essentially is a wave-like contracting and relaxing of the muscle, forcing the contents of your digestive system to move their way towards your backside. However, the caffeine causes you to poop after drinking coffee idea has since been debunked for, well, several reasons. Now, to begin with, caffeine will usually begin its stirring effects about 15 minutes after ingestion. Those effects will continue for several hours, with its half-life at around 5 to 6 hours on average. So why is this important here? One study specifically looked at the colon's response to coffee by placing an anal probe in the large intestines of those who had an increase in peristalsis from it. Coffee's crappy effects were shown to begin within 4 minutes after ingestion, and the increase in peristalsis remained for only approximately 30 minutes. These timeframes do not support caffeine being this particular promoter of poop. The caffeine cause was further debunked when it was shown that increased peristalsis did not happen with other caffeinated beverages, but would happen with decaffeinated coffee. So if it's not the caffeine, what in coffee is causing the urge to defecate in some people? While it hasn't been proven yet, the leading theory behind coffee's boost in productivity of your waste management system is a combination of several hormonal and neural mechanisms, some of which are known and some of which are currently probably unknown. The known include a rise in acid production within your stomach and the release of the two hormones gastrin and cholecystokinin, which have something of a laxative effect. To begin with, coffee is relatively acidic, having a pH of between 4.5 and 6. And for reference, in case you've forgotten your high school chemistry, 7 is neutral. In fact, there have been over 40 types of acid found in roasted coffee. These can be broken down into 3 different groups: aliphatic, alicyclic, carboxylic, and chlorogenic. Importantly, chlorogenic acid will also promote increased acid production by your stomach, elevating the acidic environment. In healthy people, this acid bath will aid in the digestion of proteins and fats. The stomach responds to the acid production by moving its contents more quickly into your small intestine. Increased acid levels will also trigger the release of gastrin and cholecystokinin, which provokes the aforementioned peristalsis. Gastrin is produced when the body senses the presence of food in the stomach, or your vagus nerve gets stimulated by one of your senses like taste or smell in response to food. Its release causes several reactions within the body. The gastroesophageal sphincter will constrict, keeping the food in your stomach, not allowing it back up into your esophagus. It increases the motility of your digestive tract and gallbladder in preparation for food's arrival into the small intestine. Simultaneously, it will relax the valve between your small intestine and colon. This will allow the food already in your small intestine to move on into the large intestine. Finally, it increases peristalsis throughout the entire digestive system. The overall result of gastrin is essentially out with the old and in with the new. Cholecystokinin, while similar in structure to gastrin, functions differently, causing other reactions. It's also released in response to food being introduced into the stomach. It stimulates your gallbladder to release bile into the intestines, which helps digest fats. This could be why people who have painful gallstones often choose to avoid coffee. It also stimulates pancreatic juices, helping to break down large food particles into molecules that can be absorbed by the body. Cholecystokinin has also been shown to stimulate your hypothalamus, signaling the body that it's had enough food, and it is thought that this is one of the mechanisms that give coffee its appetite suppression effect. All of this said, just because these are probably the main influences in your coffee-induced BM, it is still thought that there are probably other things going on as well. This is because there are over 1,000 chemical compounds found within coffee, and many can affect the gastrointestinal system. The digestive tract is also extremely complex and is still not fully understood. For instance, the morphine-like compounds found in coffee called exorphins attached to opiate receptors located throughout your body. There are 4 known types of these: delta, kappa, mu, and the very boringly named opiate receptor-like 1, or ORL1. All of these receptors are known to affect peristalsis in some way. However, it should be noted that most of these tend to have the opposite effect as coffee. They usually actually cause constipation. So why is this being considered as a contributor? The debate arises because there are so many different reactions that can take place depending on which specific type of opioid receptor gets stimulated. It also matters at what point in the signaling process of neurons you stimulate the receptor. As one researcher put it, the GI motor effects of opioids are complex because depending on whether interruption of the excitatory or inhibitory neural pathways prevails, muscle relaxation or spasms will be observed. When you combine the complex nature of opioids with the fact that there haven't been many studies specifically identifying the regulatory properties of ORL1, you begin to understand the obstacles facing researchers. For instance, it's known that ORL1 reacts more quickly than other opioid receptors, seeing results after only 2 minutes of exposure to an agonist. This makes it a tempting receptor to look at, given the timeframes associated with your distal colon's reaction to coffee. In the end, pun intended, given the extremely complex nature of the human digestive system and the multitude of compounds found in coffee, it will take a significant amount of research to nail down all the contributing factors in coffee making some people defecate. But as I finish my morning cup of coffee, I would like to thank all of those brave individuals to date who have voluntarily had an anal probe inserted for science. This gives us some idea of the mechanisms involved here, as well as safely rule out others that we previously hypothesized might be contributors. Have you ever sat next to a woman on the bus who has lost her sense of smell? Or at least you must assume so, as the eye-watering fragrance wafting from her perfume is so overpowering that the nausea it induces makes you appreciate the subtle scent of a dryer sheet. If so, well, you might wonder what causes a person to become blind to their own smell. Technically referred to as olfactory fatigue, olfactory habituation, or odor adaptation, being nose-blind might appear to be something of a defect, but the ability to have the scent of a specific fragrance, such as your
own dwindle over time is very beneficial. Imagine tiptoeing through the tulips, enjoying the lovely aroma around you, along with your own equally lovely stench. If these smells didn't diminish over time, you might miss the new smell of a cougar about to use you as a tasty meal. Or perhaps you're the hunter and you're trying to pick up the scent of your prey. In these sorts of scenarios that our sweaty hunter-gatherer ancestors with deodorantless armpits frequently found themselves in, scanning for new smells was much more useful than continuing to experience their own. The drawback, of course, in more modern times is that perfumed Peggy doesn't realize the overpowering nature of her own cougar scent. But how exactly does this work? Well, to begin with, the back of your nasal cavity, about 2 3/4 inches or 7 centimeters above and behind your nostrils, lies a special grouping of cells called olfactory epithelium. These cells are attached to the olfactory bulb within the brain by olfactory neurons. At the end of each neuron lies a receptor cell. When microscopic molecules circulating within the air, or molecules broken down in the act of chewing your food, come into contact with a receptor cell, they attach. The process is called protein-ligand binding. Once attached, it will cause an electrical signal to be transmitted down the neuron to your brain. The signal your brain receives gives us the perception of smell. There are around 350 genes from the nearly 1,000 olfactory genes that make olfactory receptors. Each gene produces a different type of receptor. Each specific receptor will react to a specific group of structurally similar molecules. Molecules from coffee, tomatoes, or Peggy's generously applied perfume, for example. A combination of several different receptors being activated will also be perceived as a different type of smell. In this way, your body can distinguish between countless numbers of different odors. And also note here, it was once thought that humans were only able to recognize about 10,000 different fragrances. Dr. Leslie Vossel and her colleagues at Rockefeller University, however, have recently shown that humans are actually able to detect at least 1 trillion different smells, and this number might be too low by a long shot. Dr. Vossel's study only used 128 different types of odor molecules to achieve the nearly 1 trillion different sensations of smell. She also noted that there are many more odor compounds found in nature than the 128 that she used. In any event, now that we know how our brains perceive smell, we can better understand olfactory fatigue. When an odor molecule attaches to a specific protein on a receptor cell, guanine nucleotide protein coupled receptors, it causes a rush of sodium and calcium into the cell. This will create an electrical difference across the cell membrane that creates the impulse your brain receives, depolarization. This rush of sodium and calcium ions goes through pathways known as CNG channels. This stands for cyclic nucleotide gated ion channels. This rapid influx of calcium will begin a cascade of chemistry that causes CNG channels to close. Once closed, similar odor molecules will be unable to activate the receptor, and it will no longer send the electrical signals for the brain to perceive as smell. Specifically, the CNG channels associated with olfactory adaptation are CNG-A4 and CNG-B1B. And for those of you who like the ultra-technical description, Drs. Jonathan Bradley, Dirk Reuter, and Stephen Frings in their 2001 report published in the journal Science explain, we find that only in the presence of CNG-A4 and CNG-B1B, the two modulatory CNG subunits of the olfactory CNG channel, can Ca2 plus minus CAM bind rapidly to the open state. In ORNs where CNG channels reach high levels of PO, the CNG-A4 subunit facilitates Ca2 plus minus CAM binding to an open channel and hence transforms the negative feedback by Ca2 plus minus CAM into the rapid and state-independent control mechanism that is needed for olfactory adaptation. Woo! So, in more layman's terms, olfactory fatigue occurs such that when you sense a specific odor, the receptors associated with that molecule can no longer be stimulated by similar molecules because the channels that create the electrical impulse will ultimately close. The result leaves only receptors that get stimulated by other molecules, different types of odors, thus your propensity to sense new smells more strongly, and the ones that you get consistently bombarded with eventually no longer get detected at all. And at that point, well, congratulations, you're now nose blind. This brings up the question, though, of how one can rapidly reverse the effects of nose blindness. Well, this is actually easier said than done. You might have seen that perfume shops often have bowls of coffee beans that they say will help reset your nose, a nasal palate cleanser, so to speak. The theory behind this seems legitimate. If attached odor molecules cause nose blindness, simply knock off those molecules and you should should be good as new. There are around 28 different types of molecules associated with coffee odors. If one or more of these odorants are stronger than the ones causing the nose to be blind, then maybe they will help reset the neurons. Unfortunately for perfume shop coffee bean suppliers, studies on the effectiveness of coffee on odor adaptation have shown that coffee is no better at reducing the effects of olfactory fatigue than simply taking in a deep breath of fresh air. Another theory on reversing olfactory fatigue revolves around returning your olfactory receptors to their baseline, namely the smell of your own skin. You achieve this by inhaling unscented portions of your skin. Once the system is more or less reset, this should allow for the new smell to be better perceived. While this often repeated method does seem reasonable enough, unfortunately there doesn't seem to be any studies looking at how well this actually works, or if it actually works at all. You will, however, find countless anecdotal accounts advocating for its effectiveness. So in the end, being nose blind, well, it does have its advantages, like you don't have to smell your own terrible garlic breath. We've actually got a video on why garlic makes your breath smell bad. You can see that below. But it can also be annoying, as in the case of other people having to smell your garlic breath because you aren't aware of it. And on a similar note to this is, of course, Perfume Peggy and her incessant need to bathe in Chanel No. 5 because she's become immune to the scent. And if you want to reset your nose so you can smell yourself, well, unfortunately, it appears that there isn't any scientific silver bullet method to reliably achieve this. This once again leaves us with the age-old method of just asking someone nearby whether you smell bad and hoping they ignore normal social graces and answer honestly. Hopefully in the future our robotic assistants will be able to smell us and tell us if we smell bad without risking committing any social faux pas.